A very common question is, what's the best form of exercise for fat loss? Is it kettlebell training? Is it walking on a treadmill? Is it doing something like CrossFit? Ultimately, answering this is incredibly complex and difficult, which is what opens it up to so much controversy. In this video, I'm simply going to talk about the things that we do know for sure as it relates to exercise intensity and fat loss. The first thing that is essential to understand is what is a whole muscle and what is a whole muscle made up of. So in this image, these are all different whole muscles. The left and right deltoid, the trapezius, any one of the hamstring or quadricep muscles. These are all different whole muscles. And what are they composed of? In the upper left-hand corner, this is a whole muscle. Let's say it's the biceps muscle. Inside of this whole muscle, there are going to be hundreds of thousands of muscle fibers. In the bottom right-hand corner, that's one muscle fiber. So hundreds of thousands of these will make up one whole muscle. So this is that one muscle fiber from the prior image. And yet again, a whole muscle would be made up of thousands of these. The reason that is so important is because when you look inside of a whole muscle, not all of the muscle fibers are functionally the same. In fact, they're quite different from one another. Some of the muscle fibers within one whole muscle will be what are called type 1 or slow twitch muscle fibers. That means they shorten very slowly. Think about them as contracting very slowly. Some of the muscle fibers within that whole muscle will be what are called type 2X or very fast twitch muscle fibers. Think of these muscle fibers as shortening or contracting very quickly. Their velocity at which they shorten is fast. And then some of the muscle fibers within a whole muscle will lie in between these. They're called type 2A, or think about them as intermediate twitch muscle fibers. They don't shorten really slowly and they don't shorten really fast. They're just kind of in the middle. The reason that understanding this is so important is because these different muscle fiber types utilize food fuels quite differently from one another. So what I mean by that is the type 1 very slow twitch muscle fibers tend to be much more reliant upon fat compared to carbohydrates or sugars. The term carbohydrates and sugars means the exact same thing. So when we look at type 2X, very fast twitch fibers, they're much more reliant upon sugars or carbohydrates compared to fats. And then the type 2A intermediate twitch fibers use a very strong combination of both fats and sugars or carbohydrates. This is very important to know when you're considering what exercise intensity is going to assist the most with fat loss. But I'm probably not going to say exactly what you think I'm going to say. So let's take a look at this line chart or line graph. What we see on the horizontal, also known as x-axis, is a percentage of exercise intensity. And that's between 0 and 100%. Think of 0% as basically being asleep, and think of 100% as the most intense exercise you've ever done in your life. So you could imagine 50% would be exactly in between those two extremes. Now on the vertical, also known as y-axis, what it is looking at is the percentage of carbohydrates and fat being used by the body as a whole at those different intensities. So it's important to make note, this is not saying what's being consumed by individual muscle fibers. It's saying at these different intensities, on a whole body level, what's the percentage of carbohydrates versus fat that's being utilized? And we'll start off at looking at very low intensity exercise. 10% of maximal exercise. So that would be basically at best a very slow walk. And what you notice is that as a percentage, there is much less carbohydrate being consumed by the body as a whole, and much more fat being consumed by the body as a whole. It's about 30% carbohydrate and 70% fat. So just to be clear, this is saying at very low intensities, like a walking pace, your body as a whole uses much more fat as a fuel, 70%, and much less carbohydrate as a fuel, 30%. Now, why is that the case? And the answer is because at very low intensities of exercise, slow twitch muscle fibers are the muscle fibers that are mostly active. And if you remember from the last slide, slow twitch muscle fibers are much more reliant upon fat than carbohydrates. So since slow twitch muscle fibers are the predominant muscle fiber that's involved with very low intensity exercise, and they use mostly fat as a fuel, that results in the body as a whole utilizing more fat during low intensity exercise than carbohydrates. And this is where people come often to the false conclusion that very low intensity exercise is actually best for burning fat. While it is true that as a percentage, the body is using more fat than carbohydrates at low intensity exercise because more slow twitch muscle fibers are being utilized at those intensities. The answer of what exercise intensity is best for consuming or utilizing the most fat is much more complicated. To try and explain why it's complex, let's move from 10% of maximal exercise intensity to 35% of maximal exercise intensity. And what you'll notice if you look at, on a whole body level, what's the percentage of carbohydrate versus fat that's being used at this intensity? It's about even. It's about 50% carbohydrate and about 50% fat. Now, why is that? Because as exercise intensity increases, what the body does is it recruits more and more faster twitch muscle fibers to be involved in the exercise in order for it to be performed. At higher intensities, basically you need muscle fibers that can shorten faster and sometimes produce more force. But if you recall, these faster muscle fiber types, regardless if you're talking about intermediate or very fast twitch fibers, they use more carbohydrates than slow twitch muscle fibers do. Intermediate uses a combination of both, and fast twitch fibers use mostly carbohydrates. But both of them, as a whole, use more carbohydrates than very slow twitch muscle fibers do, which are, again, heavily reliant upon fat. So the point is, as the exercise intensity increases and faster twitch muscle fibers get involved, those faster twitch fibers use more carbohydrates as a fuel than slow twitch muscle fibers do. So when you look on a whole body level, the percentage of carbohydrates compared to fat that's being utilized gets closer and closer and closer to one another as a percentage. And at 35% of maximal exercise intensity, the body as a whole is using about 50% carbohydrate and 50% fat. But from looking at this line graph, people will also come to an incorrect conclusion, which is, I don't want to exercise at higher intensities because this line graph makes it look like the body is actually using less fat at higher intensities when it's not. What this is showing you is that as a percentage, the amount of fat being consumed by the body is decreasing because the amount of carbohydrate by the body is increasing. So, for example, at 10% of maximal exercise intensity, the body as a whole was using 70% carbohydrate. And now at 35% maximal exercise intensity, the body is only using, as a whole, 50% fat. But a percentage and a whole number are not the same thing. So in terms of like the total quantity of fat that's being consumed by the body, that's actually continuously increasing as the exercise intensity is increasing. To depict what I mean, here is another line chart looking at exercise intensity on the horizontal axis between 0 and 100%, and on the vertical axis, it is looking at total fat consumption in grams per minute. And what you'll notice is that around 30% of maximal exercise intensity throughout the body, around 0.3 grams of fat are being consumed per minute. And then when the intensity is increased to 40% of maximal exercise intensity, look at this. Now, close to 0.4 grams of fat are being consumed per minute. So the total amount of fat that's being consumed by the body from 30 to 40% maximal exercise intensity is increasing fairly significantly. And you can probably see that's going to continue. Here you can see 50% of maximal exercise intensity. And look at that. The grams per minute of fat that are being consumed increases yet again. And this is incredibly important to understand, because you have to remember a chart like this is showing fat versus carbohydrate consumption throughout the body as a percentage. And at 35% of maximal exercise intensity, that is when the body as a whole is consuming about 50% carbohydrate and about 50% fat, which makes it appear as though the amount of fat being consumed by the body is decreasing as the exercise intensity increases, which couldn't be further from the truth. All this is showing you is that as exercise intensity increases, proportionally, there's a lot of carbohydrates that begin to be consumed with higher intensity exercise by the faster twitch fibers. So that makes the amount of fat and the amount of carbohydrate being consumed throughout the body as a percentage closer and closer to one another. This doesn't mean that the total amount of fat throughout the body as exercise intensity increases is somehow decreasing. To drive home the point even more, if we increase exercise intensity from 35% of maximum to 50% maximal exercise intensity, what you see is that now, as a percentage throughout the whole body, there's actually less fat that's being used compared to carbohydrate. The body as a whole is approximately using about 40% fat and about 60% carbohydrate. Why is this? First of all, it's because more and more fast twitch muscle fibers are being recruited. This doesn't mean that the slow twitch muscle fibers aren't involved in higher intensity exercise. They most certainly are. But the faster and faster twitch fibers just keep getting recruited more and more as the exercise intensity rises. And they rely more and more and more on carbohydrates. So the body as a whole is consuming lots of carbohydrates as the exercise intensity rises. And that makes the amount of carbohydrates being consumed by the body as a percentage increase above that of fat. But yet again, this doesn't mean that the body is decreasing the amount of fat that it's consuming. In fact, it's actively increasing the amount of fat that's being consumed. Intermediate twitch fibers, fast twitch fibers, they do use fat. Intermediate twitch fibers use a good amount of fat. Even fast twitch fibers use some fat. So it's very important not to be confused by graphs like this and think this means that higher intensity exercise equates to the body using less fat. Again, not true. Let's look at the other graph. There is a fairly significant increase in the total amount of fat that's being consumed by the body from 40% of maximal exercise intensity to 50% of maximal exercise intensity. And that actually continues on all the way to around 60% of maximal exercise intensity. Meaning that total fat consumption in grams per minute continuously increases with higher intensity exercise up to around 60% of your maximal exercise intensity. Now that's going to be a pretty like intermediate paced running speed. Exactly what that is varies significantly from one person to the next. But all of us have a pretty good idea of about what 60% of our maximal exercise intensity is. And that is actually the intensity at which the body as a whole consumes the most amount of fat. So if you're actively exercising and you want to consume, your body to consume the most amount of fat while you're exercising, it should be around 50–60% of your maximal exercise intensity. For most people, that's going to be a decent jogging to running pace. If you go beyond that, something happens. The faster twitch fibers especially will begin to produce lots of what's called lactate, which will spill out into the bloodstream, and that actually begins to inhibit the breakdown of fat in fat cells. So after that exercise intensity beyond around 60%, the total amount of fat consumed by the body actually does begin to decrease, as you can see in the graph. But there are certainly reasons and arguments to be made why exercising at intensities beyond 60% could be good for certain people as well for fat loss. The reason for that being is because very high intensity exercise will result in the body actually consuming largely carbohydrates as a fuel. Again, beyond 60% of maximal exercise intensity, the total amount of fat consumed by the body does begin to decrease. And that is taken over by a significant increase in the consumption of carbohydrate. So one might say, you don't want to do really, really high intensity exercise if you want to break down and have your body consume lots of fat. But really high intensity exercise, especially afterwards, causes metabolic rate to stay elevated for long periods of time after you're done exercising. We do not need to get into all of the specifics of this graph, but what it is showing is that metabolic rate, the energy expenditure of cells throughout your body, after you're done exercising, it stays quite elevated after the exercise is over. And during this period of time, fat serves as a very important and significant fuel source. So a strong argument can be made for certain populations. This is by no means recommended for everybody, but that really high intensity exercise, like high intensity interval training, can be very good for fat loss. Not because lots of fat is really being consumed while the exercise is taking place, but because lots of fat will be consumed by the cells of the body after the exercise is done, because the metabolic rate of those cells stays elevated for long periods of time after exercise is over. And to what degree this increase in metabolic rate after exercise is over happens is proportional to the exercise intensity. So if somebody is walking, this really hardly happens at all, assuming it's a healthy person. If somebody is exercising at 60% of their maximal exercise intensity for 30 minutes or so, this will happen to some degree, but it won't be nearly as significant as it would be if the person were exercising at a really high intensity, like a sprinting pace. So the elevation of metabolic rate after exercise is over is also proportional to the intensity. So in conclusion, what's the best exercise or exercise intensity for fat loss? Hopefully you can see how complicated of a topic this actually is. It's highly dependent upon who the individual is and what type of exercise can they tolerate. Ultimately, I think it's fair to say that in a very healthy population, walking is the least effective as it relates to fat loss. Yes, fat is the primary fuel throughout the body as a percentage during walking, but not actually very much fat as a whole is being consumed at that intensity. And very little increase in energy metabolism will occur after exercise is over at that intensity. So the two different forms of exercise that are probably best fit for actively causing fat loss are around 60% of your maximal exercise intensity sustained for 10, 20, 30 minutes at a time, or very high intensity exercise involving intervals. Both of these are going to promote the consumption of fat, but for different reasons. And both tend to be quite effective. It's largely dependent upon what the person can comfortably stick with for long periods of time, meaning weeks, months, years on end. And what's also important to note that fat loss almost always requires dietary changes as well, not just exercise. Diet is not what this video is about, but nonetheless, it's an important point to make that the fat loss benefits from these different forms of exercise will be much better realized if they're combined with an improvement in diet.